Okay, hello. My name is Marcus Stanley. I'm the Advocacy Director for the Quincy Institute. Welcome to our briefing on the Russia-Ukraine crisis. I'm going to wait just an extra minute here because we still have people logging in. I'm seeing the number increasing rapidly. So just going to wait 60 more seconds before beginning. Okay, so welcome to the Quincy Institute briefing on the Russia-Ukraine crisis. We have a very distinguished panel with us today. In fact, they have so many achievements, I'm going to have to skimp on them in order to introduce them and leave us time for discussion. Monica Duffy Toft is a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute, and she is a professor of international politics and the founding director of the Center for Strategic Studies at Tufts University's Fletcher School of Diplomacy. She's had a very distinguished academic career, including positions at Oxford and Harvard, and numerous articles and several books. And prior to her academic career, she was a military intelligence officer and a Russian language specialist in the US Army. Tom Graham is a distinguished fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He teaches, he's a research fellow and lecturer at Yale University. And before that, he was a special assistant to the president and the senior director for Russia on the National Security Council staff from 2004 to 2007, during which he managed a White House Kremlin strategic dialogue, which I'm sure had many lessons for today as well. Anatol Levin is a senior research fellow on Russia and Europe at the Quincy Institute. He was formerly a professor at Georgetown University and King's College, London. He was a journalist in South Asia, the Soviet Union, and Eastern Europe for many years before his academic career, and is the author of books on Russia and on Ukraine that are very relevant today. And he is a member of the academic board of the Valdai Discussion Club in Russia. So he has insight on the Russian perspective. The way we're going to proceed today is I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions, but we're going to try to keep the briefing portion of things to no more than 30 minutes, and then have a good 30 minutes open for questions. But I will start by asking the panelists some questions, and what we're going to work through is first the availability of a diplomatic solution to solve the crisis peacefully, the costs to the United States, to Ukraine and our European allies if diplomacy fails, and perhaps most relevant for many of you, the ways in which the Menendez-Meeks legislation that you may soon be asked to vote on, or your bosses may soon be asked to vote on, would significantly reduce, we feel, the chances of a peaceful diplomatic solution and make it harder to manage the crisis. So we feel that legislation would significantly impair US flexibility to manage this crisis to a diplomatic solution. So with no further ado, let me start asking some questions to our panelists. First, on the possibility of a diplomatic solution, do you believe that a peaceful solution to this crisis remains possible through diplomacy in a way that would avert a Russian invasion of Ukraine without the necessity for the kind of intense sanctions that we see in some of the legislation that's put forward? And Tom, why don't you start us off?
Thank you very much, Marcus, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you. Let me start by saying that any policy, U.S. policy towards Russia, has to be a combination of deterrence and diplomacy. We focused very much on the deterrent aspect of this over the past several months. We've only begun the diplomacy in a serious fashion since about the first or second week in January. And although the sides appear to be quite far apart in their positions, what we've seen in the past couple of weeks is really an activization of this diplomacy, not only between the United States and Russia, but between other Western leaders in Russia. What the United States has put on the table in terms of arms control measures, confidence building measures, are things that the Russians would like to talk about. And the response has been, yes, these are important issues, but they're secondary. The issue that we want on the table is the issue of NATO expansion, something that the United States has resisted so far. My own sense is that we're going to have to put that issue on the table in some way. And the challenge for the diplomacy is to reconcile what appear to be irreconcilable positions. The US and NATO position that NATO should be open to membership for the states of the former Soviet Union, beginning first of all with Ukraine. The Soviet position, the Russian position, that it needs to have some sort of sphere of privilege influence in the former Soviet space in order to feel secure. Now, I think creative diplomacy, flexibility on all sides can find a way of reconciling those positions. I've myself proposed a moratorium of 20 to 25 years on NATO's expansion eastward, a period that I think is long enough for the Russians to be able to say that they've got the minimal security requirements they need. It's short enough for the United States and its NATO allies to say, we haven't abandoned the principle of an open door. Now, I'm not saying this is the only way to do it. I'm saying that we do need to find a way to bridge the gap. And the fact that the alternative to a negotiated solution is a military conflict that would be catastrophic, first of all, for Ukraine, a conflict that we have no assurances that we could confine simply to Ukraine and would be in danger of spreading throughout the entire region in East Central Europe, is something that should concentrate the minds and focuses on a diplomatic solution, which I think is well within the realm of possibility.
So Monica, just building on some of the things that Tom just said, do you think it's reasonable for the U.S. to engage with these Russian concerns about NATO's eastward expansion and the security threat that Russia claims it feels? Or would engaging with those concerns be appeasing Russia and just encouraging more aggression? You're mute.
Yeah, I got it. So Tom, thank you for those comments. And I think he's laid out, the complexity of the issue. And one of the problems that we're facing is we're not actually entirely sure what Putin's entire gambit is involved, right? What are his motivations? Is he status quo oriented in the sense that he just wants NATO to stop and perhaps retreat a little bit, or does he want to push further west? So first of all, we don't know that. However, we're not going to learn that unless we talk with him and we see actually where sort of the bargaining range is. What is it that he wants? If it's truly concern over NATO expansion, right, which the United States sort of bumbled into, starting in the 1990s with the Partnership for Peace program, which actually Russia was allowed and offered to join, and then sort of moving forward and extending NATO without any sort of plan about what this meant writ large, including in terms of of Russia's strategic interests. And so here we are. Russia very clearly in 2008 made it clear after the Bucharest summit that that Russia as a state, the Russian Federation, was threatened when Georgia and Ukraine were invited to become part of NATO. This has been very clear. I don't think you need diplomacy to hear that Russia under Putin in particular felt threatened by that. So I think we do need to listen to that. And I think we as a country, the United States, and to some extent our allies as well, need to acknowledge that this has been a very clear position of the Russian Federation since day one, and perhaps acknowledge that we've contributed to this situation in some ways by not listening to that. And so I do think there is room for negotiation. What's fabulous about diplomacy is that it gives us time, right, to sort of extend the timeline here so that we don't rush into war. Putin, in a sense, is pushing that by amassing the troops in Belarus and in Ukraine, and now moving or possibly moving material into the Black Sea. So the possibility of war is quite real. And so I think the timing, trying to extend the timeline here on the diplomacy front, diplomacy is for our opponents. And so we do need to listen. And we know in any good negotiation, we're not going to get everything we want. But guess what? Neither is Putin and the Russian Federation. But at least we'll have a better sense of where each other's red lines are. The United States has said that a red line is that the Russian Federation, Putin, cannot tell us who and who cannot join NATO. However, that doesn't mean that, as Tom has recommended, one possibility is, okay, let's put it on hold for 20 years and see what happens. And maybe we can have trust building as a result so that Russian Federation can see that it truly is a defensive alliance. The problem is he doesn't see it as a defensive alliance, but perhaps over a 20-year period, another generation, we may be able to persuade him of that, or if he's not in power any longer, the next Russian leader. So I do think that the United States needs to engage more seriously, and it needs to listen to what Russia has been saying for over a decade, and I would say 2 decades, about the United States. We are a formidable country. They have a right to be nervous about us. We have gone around the world and intervened in other countries, right? So the idea that this nervousness, this fear of the United States is unfounded is just wrong. The United States is formidable, which is great, but we need to acknowledge that being so formidable, we are also threatening as a result.
So Anatole, just thank you, Monica. So Anatole, just building on some of the things that were said by Tom, he mentioned that the results of a war could be catastrophic and the results of an invasion could be catastrophic. I know you've spent a lot of time in that part of the world. What do you think if diplomacy fails and we end up in a situation of conflict, what do you think the cost would be to Ukraine, to the United States, and to European security?
Well, I do think that, and what this brings out is that our first purpose must be to prevent a Russian invasion of Ukraine. I mean, too much of the discussion at the moment is about punishing Russia if it invades Ukraine, even, arming Ukraine to fight against Russia. Frankly, I mean, this takes very little account of the appalling suffering for ordinary Ukrainians that would result. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think one does need to bring out the fact that there is something weird about the whole NATO expansion debate when it comes to Ukraine. Now, you can say that for the Russians, but obviously, I mean, we are the people who are saying that the door must remain open to Ukraine, because we have repeatedly made it clear that we have absolutely no intention of fighting to defend Ukraine. What is more, nobody is thinking seriously or talking about the number of troops, American troops, who would have to be sent to Ukraine if Ukraine were in NATO to defend it against Russia. We would be talking about Cold War style deployments. Very large numbers of American ground troops backed by a very large part of the American Air Force. Now, I think we need to stop and think, what that would do to America's force posture in the world to an already overextended American military, and above all, of course, to the relative power of China. We need to think about all these things, but I do think, first and foremost, the whole point of our sanctions policy must be to make sure that Russia does not invade Ukraine, which, by the way, contrary to some of what one might hear, of course, it did that in 2014, but it has not done in recent months. And all the Russian official statements have said that Russia does not intend to do that. So there is no urgency at present, with reference to the Menendez bill. There is no urgency about imposing sanctions on Russia at the moment, because in recent months, Russia hasn't actually done anything. It has, of course, deployed forces. It has hinted at terrible things it might do, but it hasn't done them. So sanctions must be regarded as a weapon that we have to keep up our sleeves to use only if necessary. And necessary does mean a full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine.
So I'm glad you brought up the Menendez-Meeks legislation, because that's what I'd like to turn to now, is some of the details of that legislation. Really, the centerpiece, I think, of the legislation is the sanctions provisions in Title III, which contain very extensive economic sanctions, both on individual Russian leaders and the broader Russian economy. And the mechanism by which those sanctions would be imposed is that they would all be triggered at once if the United States government made a finding that Russia was engaged in a significant escalation in hostilities in Ukraine with the aim or effect of undermining the government of Ukraine, occupying Ukraine, or even interfering with the sovereignty of Ukraine. And once these sanctions are in effect, they would be very difficult to remove because they would require a formal settlement with the government of Ukraine. So Ukraine would basically have veto power whether the sanctions are removed. What are the issues with this framework from the perspective of diplomacy and crisis management? And I think I'll go back to Tom for this one, because we're cycling through. But do you have thoughts on that? And
let me just make a couple of comments here. First, on the whole idea of the congressional legislation at this point. I understand that the White House is working with the Congress in order to shape these sanctions, but I can tell from my own experience in government that the executive branch really doesn't look upon favorably on congressionally legislated sanctions, particularly when they get into tactical issues. It reduces the flexibility that the administration has in order to conduct serious negotiations and to make the types of trade-offs that will lead to an acceptable compromise and negotiated solution for all sides. So I can understand the administration trying to shape this to maintain as much latitude for its own flexibility as possible. But the bottom line is that this will reduce the flexibility that the administration needs. The second point that I would make, and this is broader than the legislation itself, but goes to the heart of the sanctions issue. We are talking about devastating sanctions. We're going after much of the Russian leadership, the economy now, not simply isolated segments of the economy, but with things that will do significant economic damage. This one will certainly push Russia closer to China, and Anatol has already raised this issue. A strategic competitor, we don't have an interest in a closer strategic alignment between Russia and China. Two, we need to understand that these sanctions are going to have significant consequences for the global economic environment. Russia is a major exporter of energy, oil and gas. It's a major exporter of grain right now. It's one of the few sources of titanium, which is indispensable for aviation industry. All these markets will be roiled by the type of sanctions that are now being considered. And we have to make sure that we've thought through the consequences of this and whether an effort to punish Russia at this point turns around and punishes us and undermines the very institutions that have been a foundation of American prosperity and security for decades and could be going forward. And the third point here, which I don't think we ever give enough consideration to, is that Russia can respond. Russia is a big power. It has tools. It has cyber tools, we know, and it can use those cyber tools in many ways, including against critical infrastructure in the United States. If we do some of the things that we're threatening on the financial and economic side, we push Russia against the wall, we do have to expect an attack against critical infrastructure in the United States, financial institutions, for example. And the question I would have for all of you on this call is that if Russia were to go after a major financial institution in the United States and wipe out the records, how many of you could document your financial assets? What do we do in a situation like this? So this is not to say we don't do sanctions, but it is to say that we need to think very carefully through what the consequences are to be sure that we are prepared to meet what Russia might do in response.
Scary example. And Anatol, I wanted to just go back to you for a minute on the sanctions. The structure of these sanctions, which is laid out in law here, so it would become legislation, is that they have a fairly low threshold for being triggered. They're all or nothing. They all go on at once, and they're hard to take off. What do you think that does for crisis management?
Well, I mean, this has really rather terrifying implications because the bill is very, very loosely worded about what the trigger would be. And of course, if the bill does pass, and if then some Russian action or alleged Russian action does trigger it, and, according to the wording of the bill, this could be a cyber attack, it could be a relatively minor clash in the Donbass. Remembering, of course, that, Russia is already in violation of multiple aspects of the bill. Well, if then all these sanctions are triggered, Russia essentially has nothing to lose. We have no weapon left in our economic armory. And that could be read simply as an invitation to Russia to invade Ukraine. If Russia has nothing to lose economically from that because sanctions have been imposed already, then why not? Now, of course, the other aspect about these sanctions is, Tom has alluded to the fact that they would, impose serious costs on the US. But of course, much more immediately, they would impose much more serious costs on the Europeans, and it's not just those European countries dependent on Russian gas, but of course also those European countries, notably Germany, who do trade heavily with Russia. Now, the Europeans would, I think, go along with this in the event of a full-scale Russian invasion. But trying to impose these sanctions on them in response to a much, much smaller Russian action risks splitting NATO down the middle. It risks a really serious clash between at least some of the Europeans, but Germany and France are, of course, the most important ones, and the United States. Well, since we've repeatedly accused Putin of wanting to divide the Western alliance, maybe it's probably not a very good idea for us to do so ourselves.
And there could even be costs here at home on things like gas prices and so on, because this could be very disruptive to the global energy market. But moving on from the sanctions, another big feature of this bill is a very significant slug of new military assistance to the Ukraine. In addition to the several hundred million that we've given them just over the last 2 months, there'd be an additional 500 million plus surplus U.S. military equipment, plus people are discussing a kind of a lend-lease program that would give more military equipment. Is there anything, Monica, I wanted to ask you, are there any risks associated with this, or is there anything wrong with this, given that we do want to help Ukraine defend themselves?
Well, I mean, the most obvious is that it's leading to an escalation, right, of arms, right? This is what we call a spiral of arms, and Russia is already moving more men and material into the region, and it could be in part because of the aid that we've already done. So if a war comes, if a conflict comes, it's going to just make it that much more bloody, right? It's going to be that much more horrific. I mean, we are talking about a war here, and I don't think we want to forget that. So that's one. And the second thing is these are really sophisticated weapon systems that we're providing, and they're defensive, but they're going to require trainers, Western trainers, American and otherwise. And so what happens if a group of them gets killed, right, during one of these conflicts, if something happens? So it actually could ramp up a confrontation and escalate it without inadvertently, without us actually wanting to happen. So I just think and on top of that, of course, Ukraine can't afford it. So that's why people are talking about a lend-lease. But, I think the money would be better spent sort of trying to help Ukraine build its economy after having to deal with the crisis after 2014 in Crimea and then the Donbass region. So, good can come of it at this point. It's a little premature because the honest to God truth is that Ukraine, it has a fighting chance to sort of bloody Russia, but Russia's going to get a bloody nose, whereas Ukraine is going to be occupied. And so this is not a war that Ukraine is going to win. And as Anatol said, the Americans don't have the stomach, nor do we even have the troops to deploy there to help them out. 8,500 troops is a drop in the bucket. Russia's got 100,000 right now amassed on the border, another 30,000 come. And guess what? It's sitting in the neighborhood and it can bring more in. Ukraine, is talking about now increasing the size of its military, but it takes time to train people up, right? And yes, it's got militias and that sort of thing. So I think at this point, I'm quite nervous because what we're doing is we're throwing more material into the fight. And I'm not sure, again, that we have a broader strategy of what we're hoping to do. I think what we're trying to do is just to help Ukraine bloody Russia's nose more and just to make it more painful, to punish it again. But these sorts of weapon systems in Ukraine's situation is not going to help it to win and to defeat Russia.
Yeah, there was a recent Rand Corporation report, I think last week, that said this, that there's really no amount of military aid we're going to give that can make Ukraine's military equal to Russia. So I want to move on to questions in a moment, but I just want to ask one more, or to questions from the audience in a moment. I just want to ask the panel one more question. Given the dangers of a war to Ukraine, and given the ways in which excessive U.S. hawkishness could trigger such a war, why is the Ukrainian government pressing for more immediate U.S. actions in the face of this kind of risk? Or to some degree they're not. To some degree they've more recently been kind of warning us off. But I'll give this question to you guys. Anatol, you want to start?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Ukrainian policy on this has been really rather contradictory and even amusing, because, of course, for years, the Ukrainians were talking up the Russian threat and, appealing very strongly, and some of them still are in Washington. But then, belatedly, of course, the Ukrainian government realized that this talking up constantly this threat of war in Ukraine, to put it mildly, is not good for Western investment in Ukraine, because Western corporations do, alas, tend to think rather more of the security of their investments than they do about the interests of freedom and the West. And so now the Ukrainian government is trying to talk down the threat of war, helped by the fact, once again, that Russia has deployed troops. Not, in my view, actually enough to invade at present. We would have to see a considerable build-up before that could happen. But the Russian government has, let's not forget, repeatedly denied that it is going to invade. And it seems that at present there is no attempt at whipping up war fever in Moscow. Of course, they can well, over the next few months, try to create the incidents that would create some sort of semi-plausible excuse, not really plausible, but what they would think was plausible. But just at the moment, it seems that actually the Ukrainian government is trying to reduce the talk of war and reduce tension. And I think, that does bring us to another important point, which is that if Ukraine is ever really to join the West, and remember that, if you're looking at Poland and the Baltic states, this meant joining the European Union as well as NATO. The European Union was the economic anchor of these countries in the West. Well, Ukraine has to prosper and grow economically and attract Western investment and, of course, carry out economic reforms in a way that it has not done to date and cannot do if there is going to be an indefinite atmosphere of impending war. So I think we also have to think, rather carefully about just how we can best help Ukraine. And it isn't necessarily by constantly talking up the Russian military threat.
Yeah. Okay, so before we go on to questions from the attendees, did Tom or Monica, do you have anything to add before we go on?
Yeah, I just wanted to add 2 points. One is that I think what's happened here too, and Tom alluded to it at the beginning, is that this sort of caught people flat-footed in the fall, right? And then into December. And only now are we starting to get the full grasp of what the issues are that are on the table, and we can now talk about them. And only now, and I think this is what the Ukrainian government now is thinking about it, are we thinking about the second, third, and fourth order effects, right? We weren't really thinking about it as war or no war, and it's actually much more complicated that. The different elites, leaders, countries are dealing with domestic audiences, regional audiences, and then of course the international global community. And that's with Putin all the way down, that's with Ukraine, and that's also the United States. Domestic politics are playing here, regional politics, NATO is playing here, and so is global international politics and norms and law. And so now I think we are finally getting the full conversation going, which is very, very good, by the way. Then I want to talk to just quickly on the sanctions point that we broached earlier, which is that we don't want to forget that most times sanctions don't work. Right. And in part because you have to have everybody on a board. And Anatol already talked about divisions within the NATO alliance itself, but also China is sitting here and we're basically feeding Russia to China and creating sort of a friendship out of desperation, basically, for Russia at a time when the United States should really be thinking about who is the peer competitor that's on the horizon. It's not Russia. It's not the Russian Federation. It's China. And so sanctions, they're a blunt tool. They tend not to work. And Russia is even more prepared than it was in 2014. And we haven't cowed them since, for the last 6-8 years from the first set of sanctions, and it's even more prepared now. Yes, they're more sophisticated. Yes, the SWIFT banking system, but they have taken some measures to sort of diminish the amount of harm that could be that would be done if these were to be imposed.
Okay, thank you for a very good and vigorous discussion, and let's open this up to questions. I believe that if you raise your hand, I will see you, and my friend Sam will make you visible to ask a question. So indicate by raising your hands whether you would like to ask a question. Or you can use the Q&A. Yeah, you can also use the Q&A box at the bottom. Actually, I should have informed people of this earlier. There's a chat box for questions at the bottom, and if you enter one there, we will see it. I'm sorry, that was my
Q&A, one question.
okay. So Jenna Arnott, Yeah, Jenna Arnott has a question asking if we have any legislative recommendations.
I mean, I think that the consensus of this group would be that the US administration already has, the weapons it needs, and that, as Tom has emphasized also, for successful negotiations, it is very important that the negotiating parties have flexibility. And of course, that I'm sure we would all agree that if, God forbid, Russia does invade, then there will need to be, very substantial new action. But for me, at least, as of today, I do not think that further legislative action is needed, and we can afford to wait to see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
And just to expand on that a minute, the president has incredibly broad discretionary authorities to impose sanctions through IEPA and CATSA. These are very extensive. So to some degree, when Congress acts, there's really no need to give additional authority. And what we see in like Menendez Meeks is not really giving authority for things they can't already do, but kind of telling them or trying to force them to do it under certain circumstances. And that's when the flexibility gets narrowed, is when you try to do that. And I think one thing that offices can do that want to show that they take this crisis seriously is just to say the president can do X, Y, and Z sanctions in case of a Russian invasion, and we support them doing X, Y, and Z sanctions. And we also want to leave them free to calibrate these sanctions to what Russia actually does, and also to lift the sanctions if Russia stops doing the bad thing, which really this bill doesn't really allow. So there are options for doing that. So on questions, you can raise your hand if you want to be recognized and appear on camera or appear verbally to speak, or you can just type questions into the Q&A if you want your questions read. So from Alexander Nordahl, would Russia end the Nord Stream 2 pipeline project if the US enacts sanctions, and how does how would that affect our European allies?
Well, I don't think, I defer to the other panelists, that it's going to be Russia that ends the Nord Stream pipeline. After all, people have a tendency to forget that Russia does need the money, right? Russia is not giving this gas. The Germans and others are paying for it. So, I mean, the threat has been that it will be our side that ends the pipeline. I mean, also, in the circumstances of a new crisis, Russia would be extremely anxious to try to, woo the West Europeans to some extent. And of course, the maintaining the gas flow would be a critical way of doing that. So I think if Nord Stream is going to be ended, it would have to be ended by us.
Can I just go ahead? Go ahead, Monica.
No, which is why we've had so much tension between the Americans and the Germans, right? Because the Germans want to keep it going because it's so much more dependent on the gas coming through. And so for our European allies, this is a serious issue, which is why over the longer term, they've been talking about this, they've got to diversify their energy needs, right? They're going to have to, because they cannot be held hostage to these pipelines coming out of Russia if it's the case that Russia is going to hold them hostage in some way. But this is, again, it's leading to tensions between the allies, because the Americans, we appreciate, what the Europeans are facing, but on the other hand, this seems to be a pretty big lever or card that Putin can play if he wants to, by holding, gas flows hostage to this crisis and to other crises as we've seen in the past.
Well,
I would just make one point here, if I could, Marcus.
You're going-
First, we need to remember that no gas is flowing through Nord Stream 2 at this point.
No, it's not.
We could stop and shut down that project.
Mhm.
That will create an incentive for the Russians to seek control of the trunk lines through Ukraine as a way of gaining further control over the flow of gas into Europe. So in an ironic way, our effort to shut down Nord Stream 2 would encourage Russia to be more aggressive in its approach to Ukraine.
Mhm.
And it's also true that this is kind of putting what Monica said on its head a little bit, that Nord Stream 2 could increase Russia's leverage over Europe, but the reverse is somewhat the case too, that Russia actually does need that money. And
Mhm.
having Nord Stream cut off is a big reason for them not to invade Ukraine. It would be a loss, because I think almost certainly it does get cut off if they do.
Mhm. Yeah.
So going ahead and cutting off Nord Stream even before they take any action is actually giving away some deterrent value.
Can I just make one final point on this?
Sure.
I don't want to extend this too long. Russia is sitting on over $600 billion in foreign currency reserves at this point. The amount of money it would lose from not shipping gas into Europe is quite limited. Russia could survive that for a long period. We shut down Nord Stream 2 or stop it. The Russians could respond by cutting off gas flows to Europe. Russia can afford that much more easily than Europeans can afford not having heat this winter. So I think that's something else to bear in mind when you think about Nord Stream 2.
Okay.
And again,
Especially if
yeah.
the Chinese are willing to bail them out in some way.
Yeah, no, and again, I think that Mark is back to the question about diplomacy that you started with, which is that these issues are only now coming into focus. And so we need time to debate them, because we have leverage in some ways, and the Russian Federation has leverage in some ways. And it's only now that we can sort of put all that on the table and we can start debating and discussing them, and in a sense using them as carrots, but then also as sticks, in order for us to come to some sort of resolution short of war in this crisis.
Thank you. And I stand corrected on that last point I made about Nord Stream. So this next question, Anatol, I know this is something that you've thought about a lot about. What additional ideas do the panelists have for dealing with the question of NATO membership for Ukraine? And then the question goes on to note that Fred Kaplan, the reporter, floated a number of diplomatic ideas, including the issuance of a NATO statement explaining the reasons why Ukraine is not eligible for membership today, and the idea of holding behind the scenes talks with the Ukrainian government, offering various economic benefits in exchange for his withdrawing his request for NATO membership. And I know you've thought a lot about options for both pursuing Minsk II and for potentially the neutrality of Ukraine.
Well, I think, I mean, following Tom, I mean, what we need to find is a way of shelving this issue without excessive humiliation for both sides. Now, that would exclude, in my view, from our point of view, simply, meeting Russia's demand to give up permanently Ukrainian membership of NATO. Not that actually we couldn't do that, because it is, in my view, in the highest degree unlikely that Ukraine ever will be part of NATO, but probably that would be too much of a sacrifice of face for us. But if we could declare a moratorium, if we could get the Ukrainians to, if not give up, then suspend for a certain period their application, which would, come to the same thing as a moratorium, all of these would be ways, of reaching an agreement with Russia without, giving up our basic point of principle for whatever, that may be worth. I mean, on other points, it should be remembered that the only way, and I stress the only way that the Donbass, the separatist area of eastern Ukraine, will be reincorporated in Ukraine is through some version of the Minsk II agreement. In other words, fully guaranteed autonomy within Ukraine. Under international guarantees, because the only other option is a Ukrainian attempt to reconquer it, which will lead to disaster for Ukraine. And of course, this this agreement was signed by the Ukrainians and the Russians. It was brokered by the French and the Germans. It was endorsed by the United States in 2015. But we need to understand very clearly that it is above all the Ukrainian government and parliament, which has refused to take the essential first steps in implementing this agreement. And so whether some sort of statement of new commitment on the part of the Ukrainian government, or a statement of new commitment on our part, or of course, since this was a French-German project, this I think is one compromise that is already occurring to a limited degree, the restarting of the Normandy process and talks on this issue in Paris. But that would once again simply be to follow through on something that actually we have in principle already committed ourselves to. And a key reason why the Ukrainian government and parliament have, despite signing Minsk II, refused to go ahead with it, is the fear that an autonomous Donbass within Ukraine would act to block Ukraine's membership of NATO. But the point about this is that this is, I feel sorry for the Ukrainians, but the fact is this is a totally false argument, because of course, as long as the conflict in eastern Ukraine continues, Ukraine will never be a member of NATO in any case. Mm-hmm. So nobody is actually sacrificing anything here.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's not everybody on the Hill seems to understand that a lot of this is about the issue, not of Ukraine as a whole, but Eastern Ukraine, and whether agreement can be reached on some kind of autonomy, cultural and just to a certain degree political autonomy, but under Ukrainian sovereignty of Eastern Ukraine, and that is really a possible solution. We have a number of additional questions I want to be sure to get to. Do you believe, and this sort of builds on what Monica said at the very beginning of the event, so I'll ask this to you. Do you believe during diplomatic discussions there is any way to reconcile Russia's longstanding view of the United States as a pervasive power encroaching on their sovereignty?
It's a great question, Jacqueline. And what I would say is, look, we're dealing with great power politics. It might feel very old fashioned, but Russia is going to be intimidated by the United States because we're a big power and we're a big state. And we are, allied with European partners. And Russia is insecure. Putin has lamented time and time again the demise of the Soviet Union. He will never forgive Gorbachev for that. And so the idea that it's always going to be sort of under the eye or under in the shadow of the United States, I don't think we can get around that. It's lost prestige, it's lost power. However, that doesn't mean that we sort of have to punch it while it's down. I think one of the brilliant foreign policy moves was under George Bush Sr., H.W. Bush, and how he handled sort of the demise of the Soviet Union and allowing for Soviet leaders to save face. And I think we're sort of dealing with that now. Prestige and status matters in the international system. And the United States does not have to go out there and carry a big stick. We have a big stick, but how we carry it, we don't have to sort of swat people with it. And I hate to say, in the last 15, 20 years, our level of intervention around the world, a lot of states, a lot of citizens around the world now see us as a bigger threat than Russia. Think about that. And so the United States, it's not surprising that Russia feels not only is it a shell of itself after the Soviet Union, but the United States has been quite interventionist internationally. And so Russia is not alone feeling this way, that it's under the United States' thumb in some ways, not completely. Russia is still, why we're talking about this on such a grave level, is it's a nuclear armed state. The threat of thermonuclear war still is there in some semblance of form. Let's pray it doesn't happen. But really, we're talking great power politics 101. The United States is stronger. It is, allied with partners who, and is sort of in Russia's backyard. It is a threat. We can't help it. We're big. We've got weapons. We can help out weaker powers, and we have, and we do. But how we do it, this is what diplomacy is all about. Can really help to ameliorate the situation and alleviate concerns in some circles.
Can I just add something here, Marcus?
Yeah.
I think that some of the issues that the administration has already put on the table in terms of confidence building measures, arms control measures, if negotiated, would go a long way to easing Russia concerns, much the way similar measures did during the Cold War. It would also, in a sense, raise Russia's status as an international player, that the United States regarded them with sufficient respect that it saw a need to negotiate these reciprocal measures. So military restraint along Russia-NATO frontier is good for everybody. And I think Moscow would welcome that. I think second, if we were to defer talk of NATO expansion into the former Soviet space for an extended period, an issue that is, I think, of great sensitivity to Russia, that would also ease their concerns. Final point here, if we do that, in particularly regard to Ukraine, the point to stress that this does not mean that we're abandoning Ukraine. There are certain things that we can do to help Ukraine develop its own defense capabilities so that it can stand alone for a long period. There's much that can be done with the modernization of the defense industrial complex in Ukraine. There's certain ways we can engage in intelligence exchanges. So there are a whole host of things that we could do, even with NATO off the table for an extended period, that would be beneficial to Ukraine, and I think in many ways less threatening to Russia.
And frankly, some of this is symbolic because, as Anatol pointed out, there's no practical possibility for Ukraine to enter NATO in the near future anyway. So to some degree, we may end up starting a war over blundering into war over a principle as opposed to practical difference. So we've had several folks have talked about China. What implications does the current situation in Ukraine have for the security of Taiwan against a possible invasion from the PRC?
I mean, I can start addressing that. I mean, I think it has big implications. First and foremost, the United States is distracted, and China, again, is paying attention to our distraction and will take advantage of that. But secondarily, how we resolve this is going to signal to China how we would resolve the situation with them in Taiwan and also Hong Kong. And so in an ideal world, we want to be able to show that we still have strength and that we can resolve issues without the resort to force. And hopefully that would signal to China that because that norm against the use of force, let's hope that we can keep it alive. So that's very important. If we can get away in this situation by sort of de-escalating it through diplomatic measures and other measures to signal to China that the use of force is not acceptable either in Hong Kong or in Taiwan, both territories.
Tom or Anatol, anything to add to that?
No.
Okay, so the next question is very relevant. I was a Hill staffer, and I feel this one. Assuming that some legislation is forthcoming and that for political reasons it will need to be stronger than simply reiterating the president's existing sanction authorities, what should it look like? So let me take the first crack at that one. I kind of feel the political situation when I talk to staffers up there. There's this sense, that you need a side-by-side, that you can't just vote against Menendez Meeks without having some alternative. And I would say that this is a very, very serious situation, and in matters of war and peace, one should not be completely governed by the sort of immediate political pressures, and that people who have stood up in the past against a rush to war often, often history looks kindly on them. And the truth is that if Congress sort of forces the administration's hand on sanctions in a way that escalates the situation, does military assistance that puts U.S. trainers into Ukraine, forces the imposition of sanctions that have significant economic effects negatively that could boomerang back here at home, or split the NATO alliance, you know, this is going to be a very harmful thing, and it's just not right to, you know, on something of that magnitude. I think it's valuable to impress on your boss that you know, this is a historic question here, and one shouldn't just necessarily go along with the crowd. Now in terms of legislation, you know, I don't think the president really needs new authorities. There's all kinds of legislation that are resolutions or findings or lay out a path for the administration. And I think, you know, I think people standing up and advancing legislation that says that that we should prioritize a peaceful solution to this crisis, and that yes, we have sanctions and we should use them if Russia does something very severe, but they should be calibrated. You know, legislation like that would make a big difference because it would help strengthen the administration against political pressure, and legislation like that, even though you could say that it's simply reiterating authorities or it's findings or resolutions, can make a really big difference in this environment. So, and there are other things. There's economic aid that can be given to Ukraine. There's, along the lines of what Fred Kaplan said, you know, offers of economic aid in exchange for Ukraine taking real action on Minsk II to actually solve this problem of the Donbass. You know, there are options. So, having given my little speechlet, I'll hand it over to the other panelists.
Yeah, Marcus, can I just add, you know, the bottom line is this crisis is over sovereignty, state sovereignty, and paradoxically, the way the legislation is written right now is that Ukraine has to give agreement, right, for these sanctions to be removed. So we're basically creating a problem where we're actually abrogating some U.S. sovereignty. So at a minimum, think through the end game here about what if these sanctions any sanctions go into place, how we are going to be in a position to take them back and not diminish our room for maneuver as a country, because that would be disastrous to the United States. Another state should not be telling us what to do, especially when we're trying to help them and actually help them to retain some semblance of sovereignty over their affairs.
I entirely agree. I'd just like to add an obvious point, but you know, sanctions do, after all, have a very, very poor record when it comes to actually working. Mm-hmm. You know, as witness the fact that the North Korean regime is still there, the Iranian regime is still there, the Communist Party still rules over Cuba. Sanctions have had no effect on China whatsoever. There have been sanctions against Russia, you know, since 2014. They have not led Russia to withdraw. The point about actions of this kind, after all, is that they're supposed to have an effect. If they have a proven record of not having an effect, then introducing more of them in the hope that it will look different than in the past looks, well, not wholly rationally based, shall I say gently. Mm-hmm.
So I believe we have one more question, and if someone would like to ask an additional question, I think we probably have time for one more after this if someone wants to ask. But how much does domestic public opinion impact the calculations of the Russian government in the event of an invasion? If substantial sanctions and losses of Russian troops occur, is it likely the Russian people will sour on the invasion, and will Putin care?
I can take a quick stab at that.
Sure.
But first, you know, public opinion polls in Russia indicate that the Russian public is not interested in a war over Ukraine. Those polls also indicate that if a war over Ukraine does come about, Russians believe it will have been imposed on Russia by the West. In a situation like that, the initial response of the Russian people is going to be rallying around the flag. In many ways, they're no different from Americans in that regard. It will take many months, even years of conflict for the Russians to sour on military action against Ukraine. So But yeah, I think it's worthwhile putting yourself in the shoes of Russians, or asking yourself how you would react if the United States were attacked, or we thought a war was imposed upon us by Russia. The initial response is not going to be cave and to say we're sorry. It's going to be to rally, support the government. And so additional sanctions bill only enhances or intensifies the feeling that it's the West that's out to get Russia and not Russia that is creating problems.
And Anatole, you were recently at the Valdai meetings where you had the chance to talk to many Russians. What's your perspective on the internal political situation there?
Well, I think that certainly, rational members of the Russian elites would, worry very much about and the consequences of an invasion of Ukraine, which is, after all, why they haven't done it yet, and are saying that they won't. Above all, in terms of how they would manage to run any parts of Ukraine that they occupied. By the way, nobody I talked to, nobody thought either that Russia would try to occupy the whole of Ukraine, including Kiev and the very strongly ethnic nationalist areas, nor did anyone think that Russia would attack NATO in any way. I mean, people laughed at this as a scenario. So it would be a question of occupying certain additional areas of the Russian-speaking areas of the east and south if there were an invasion, and then from what I gathered, but of course who knows, this would be followed by a new offer of negotiations, which might be, for example, now we want a wider autonomy for Russian-speaking areas. The point is that Russia would not, in my view, or in the view of anyone I talked to, try to actually annex more of Ukraine, nor would they even aim to occupy larger areas of Ukraine in the long run. In other words, this would be, the basis for another attempt at negotiations and the withdrawal of Russian forces, in return for, once again, what they're asking, ruling out NATO expansion, federalism within Ukraine. Of course, part of the problem here with sanctions is that if we've nailed ourselves to sanctions, especially as Monica has said, which are then dependent on the Ukrainian government to lift again, we may make it impossible to negotiate a Russian withdrawal at all, if, God forbid, the Russians do invade. But the other thing I'd say is that if you look at what very well-informed Russian commentators have been saying, the consensus among them, among the Moscow-based ones, is that indeed that there is not yet a Russian government or Putin decision for war, and that there may well not be, and that Russia would in fact be satisfied with much more limited concessions as long as it can feel that it has got something out of this process. Now, of course, these people could be wrong, but that is what they're saying. The whole tone of the discussion in Moscow, of the discourse in Moscow, is really very significantly different from the rather overheated atmosphere that we have had in the West, which, by the way, to repeat, the Ukrainian government itself is now trying to cool down again. So I don't think we are facing there isn't likely to be an invasion next week or next fortnight or whatever. There is still room for negotiations and compromise.
Mhm.
All right. Well, on that note, it's 5:35, and I want to thank everybody for participating. I especially want to thank our panelists, as well as all of you who contributed great questions. I'm going to just drop my name and an email address in the chat here. People should feel free to reach out to me and the Quincy Institute, either if you want to talk to an expert on these issues or for material on all these issues: NATO expansion, our relationship with Russia, the analysis of the Menendez-Meeks bill. We're very happy to respond to any requests for that. So thanks to everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you,
Thank you
Marcus.
so much.
Thank you.